Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go! Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and today I wanted to talk to you about slip casting and to give you basically my top 10 slip casting tips. So I've been slip casting for quite a long time, and through that time there's been quite a lot of things that have like gone wrong because pottery is all about basically experimentation, things going wrong, improving on processes. So I thought like, I wonder if this would be a good thing to put in a podcast episode, to share with you like my top 10 tips that I found out like the hard way, just so you can just like hopefully like save you the bother of like going through the same thing, but also just kind of like letting some other interesting things I found out as well about slip casting, things that have really been working for me, that I wanted to share with you, in case they could work for you too. So essentially I'm going to just do a little intro about like what slip casting is. This might be the first you've ever heard of slip casting, and or you might be like a slip casting pro, tuning in, like get some tips. But essentially slip casting is it's a process, it's a pottery making process where you basically pour clay, which is in liquid form, into a plaster mold, and then what happens is you wait a certain amount of time, and then you pour the clay out again, and then what's left, because the plaster has been drawing in the water from the clay, what's left is a kind of layer of slightly harder clay, that then you kind of, you've poured out the kind of the other part of the clay, and then you're left with a kind of clay shell, I guess is the right way of describing it. So it could be like, you can use slip casting for all sorts of things. You could cast a vase, in a 2-part mold. There's different parts molds. You can do a 1-part mold casting where basically you're just say like a bowl shape, you're pouring the clay in, you're pouring the clay out, and then you're just lifting that shape out. Or it could be like a 2-part mold where basically 2 halves of a mold like come together to make a sort of like, say, like a vase shape or something. Then you pull the 2 parts apart when the clay is a lot drier, and you're left with a vase shape. Or mugs can be cast in that way too. And essentially it's the kind of industrial way of making pottery today, basically. So most of the ceramics that you'll see in shops, sort of the things you'd see ceramic things like, say, like in a bathroom, like a sink or like a toilet or something. Those kind of things are also slip cast. So it's a kind of industrial type pottery process that we can utilize as like handmade potters, and it's a really fantastic thing for potters because it means you can just make the same shape over and over again. So you can make like sets of things, you can really standardize your kind of making process, you can put loads of creativity into the decoration of something, or when you're kind of glazing it or something, but it enables you to kind of really cut down on that work of making things over and over again, but also just making a really nice standard thing that you can make, that you can repeat basically. So yeah, slip casting is really, really good, and you can make your own molds for slip casting, your own plaster molds. That's what I do, or you can you can buy a mold from a pottery supplier as well. So they sell plaster molds for slip casting, and you can buy slip. You can buy liquid slip from a pottery supplier too, or you can make your own. So let's get on to the tips. Just had to move then because I was a bit uncomfortable. So okay, so the first thing is that so this is a tip that if you're making your own plaster mold, so if you're thinking, oh, I'm just gonna try making my own mold, I basically learned from YouTube videos, and also this really good book on slip casting and mold making by Andrew Martin. That's where I learned everything I know basically about slip casting, and also just loads of trial and error. But if you're making your own mold, the first top tip is that you have to let your mold dry for a really long time. So that's tip number one. Your plaster mold has to be like bone dry before you start casting in it. Okay, so you think like, oh, I can make a mold and then I can just start slip casting, but actually that's just it's kind of like you just have to wait basically a really long time, and often you have to wait even kind of like 3-4 weeks for a mold to dry out properly. Plaster does take a long time to dry out properly. You've got to really you can speed up the process by kind of passing air over it, you could put a fan near it or something, but you're just gonna have to wait basically until your plaster mold is dry enough. So if you're buying a plaster mold from a pottery supplier, chances are that's going to be dry already. They probably made them and then have them in stock sort of thing, but you can obviously feel the plaster to see if it's dry. If it's not bone dry, then it won't absorb the water out of the clay properly, and you just won't be able to cast with it basically. So you really do have to wait until it's actually properly dry. Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two is that you can't speed up the drying process of a plaster mold. Okay, so you can obviously, like I was just saying, you could maybe put a fan next to it or something, but you can't, say if you were going to try and dry it with heat or something, plaster really doesn't like being heated up, so you really can't encourage it to dry by basically maybe putting in a kiln, or putting it on top of a kiln, or in a place which is hot and stuff. Plaster just doesn't like that, so you need to just dry it in a nice temperate environment. And so that's tip number two, is don't heat your plaster if you're trying to dry it quicker. It just doesn't really work. Okay, so that's if you've made your own mold yourself. Okay, so my next tips relate to if you're actually making your own casting slip. So you might think that making your own casting slip is something that you would just never be able to do. You think, wow, it's that sounds really difficult. It's actually, I'm here to tell you, it's actually not. If you can make a cake, a bit if you can make a cake, you can make a glaze, because you're just literally measuring the ingredients out and mixing it together. It's exactly the same for casting slip. So if you can weigh out ingredients, and you can mix them, then you can make a casting slip. So if you're interested in a casting slip recipe, there's actually one in Eco-Friendly Pottery, 30 Simple Ways to Make Your Pottery Practice More Ethical and Sustainable, that book, which is available from the Oxford Clay website. There is a casting slip recipe in there. So if you really want to make your own casting slip, that's the tried and tested casting slip recipe that I use basically for all my work, and it's in that book. So yeah, why would you make your own casting slip? So this is basically my third top tip, is make your own casting slip. And the reason that I've put this as a tip is that it will be cheaper because you're not having to kind of transport all that water. Say if you're ordering casting slip, you know, you're having to pay the postage of like, you know, this kind of water basically, and clay obviously being like transported to you. You know, if you have the dry ingredients and you're mixing up your slip yourself, you're going to be saving on like haulage, you know, the money involved in haulage. You're going to be saving on sort of like CO2 emissions from haulage as well, because you're not sort of transporting that water to you. You know, it's much lighter. It's cheaper to make your own as well. So yeah, I'd really recommend it, because also you can control like what you put in it and what, you know, what kind of, say like you wanted like a specific color or something, you could, you know, mix certain casting slips, or you want it to be like, you know, have certain properties. If you're interested actually in sort of like all the different, there's a lot, you know, like different recipes and stuff for casting slip. Yeah, I think I was mentioning before, The Essential Guide to Mold Making and Slip Casting by Andrew Martin. That is such a good book. It basically, at the back, it's got loads of different recipes for casting slip, and that is basically where, you know, where I got the recipe, and then I sort of like adapted like some of the recipes in there. I adapted it for my own purposes. So yeah, so if you're interested in, say like, you know, you want to make like a porcelain casting slip or something, yeah, that book is so good. It's like, it's got loads of recipes in there, but you could also maybe find them like maybe online or something, or in other books as well. Yeah, you know, in terms of creating a casting slip that's like suits your needs. But so this is my tip number 4. Okay, so this is in terms of a casting slip recipe. Tip number 4 is, if possible, make sure that your casting slip recipe has ball clay in. So ball clay, it's a type of clay, and it's very strong, and you can get there's lots of different types of ball clay. Some of it has iron, you know, high contents of iron, so say like high mod ball clay. Some of it is very plastic, but generally ball clays are very strong, so they're really good to use in a casting slip because they will add like strength to your things. They will help to stop cracking. So one of Andrew Martin's tips actually is, if your work is cracking a lot, you could try increasing the amount of ball clay in your casting slip recipe. That can stop cracking, and it just makes your pottery like really, really strong. So yeah, so if possible, yeah, the recipe I've got in Eco-Friendly Pottery actually does have ball clay in. It's got 3 different types of ball clay in actually, but you could, you know, just try it with like one type of ball clay or something. Yeah, but I found that it works really, really well. It's like a stoneware casting slip that I've got in that book. So, okay, so my next tip, this also relates to casting slip recipe. So when you slip cast things, quite often they're very prone to warping, and it's to do with the fact that like you know, when you cast something, sometimes one side can be thicker than the other when you're pouring the slip out, or it could be to do with, you know, the ingredients of the casting slip, or it could just be like basically when you're throwing things on the wheel, they tend to warp a lot less than when you're slip casting stuff, and it can be such a pain. Slip casting can be really annoying when some shapes just basically just warp every time you fire them if they're slip cast. So yeah, it can be like through trial and error, but warping is a really significant problem in slip casting work. But what I found is, when I use, so one of the ingredients in a slip recipe that I use is feldspar. So feldspar is like a rock, and there's loads of different types of feldspar that you can buy from pottery suppliers. So you buy it as like a rock that's ground up into a powder, and you need to add feldspar to the recipe that I use anyway. I need to add feldspar to that slip casting recipe. And at first I was using soda feldspar. So soda feldspar is like a type of feldspar, and it was mined quite close to me, and so I thought, it was mined in Spain, I think, at the time when I was looking at, like, when I was buying those initial ingredients and started like testing different slip recipes. And yeah, the feldspar, I thought, okay, soda feldspar, that sounds great, let's go with that. And so I was like, making slip with soda feldspar, and then I sort of was reading more about it. My work was warping terribly, and I was reading more about it. I was like, why is this happening? It's so annoying. And I found out that actually soda feldspar has like a lower melting point than other feldspars. So soda feldspar is often used in glaze making. It's got a very, it's got a lower melting point than other types of feldspar. So there's another type of feldspar called potash feldspar, and that's got a higher melting point than soda feldspar. So what this means is if you're using a different type of feldspar in your pottery, in your casting slip, it's less likely to warp. So because if you're using soda feldspar, your pot might even start melting, at high temperatures. If you're firing to stoneware, it could actually start melting in those really high stoneware temperatures in the kiln. So that could be why your work is warping. So that's exactly one of the reasons why my work was warping. So what I did was I found a feldspar that was like melted at like a higher melting point than soda feldspar. So I actually in the end went for this feldspar called FFF feldspar, and that's the one I'm still using today, and it's really, really good. Again, that's like mined, geographically fairly close to me. I know that the area it comes from has got like it's got like good sort of workers' rights. I know that the environment, it's got very good legislation on the environment as well. So I know that like, as far as possible, workers and the environment are like protected in the area where that feldspar comes from. So that's why I made that choice with that particular feldspar. And it's helped to stop the warping problems in my work. So because it melts at a higher temperature, my work isn't starting to melt in the kiln when it gets to like stoneware temperatures. And so so I'd really recommend just looking into the different feldspars. If you're making your own casting slip, you might just want like a slightly higher melting feldspar if you're having warping in your work in the kiln, if you're firing to stoneware temperatures. Okay, so that's tip number 5. Tip number 6 is so a lot of slip recipes actually contain this substance called soda ash, and soda ash is a substance that so in terms of like today's industrial processes to make soda ash, so soda ash used to be, it's always been made since the Industrial Revolution. It's been made, in various ways, but the way it's made today is a kind of more environmentally harmful procedure than, say like other pottery materials. So when I was making my own casting slip, a lot of the recipes like had soda ash. The reason soda ash is used in casting slip is it's used as what's known as a deflocculant. So deflocculants are essential in slip making because what they do is they turn the clay from like a sort of hard clay into a runny substance. So there's other ways of doing that. You can use this thing called sodium silicate, which is another chemical that's used as a deflocculant. But soda ash is often used with sodium silicate in slip as a deflocculant. So I thought, well, I'm using sodium silicate in my slip anyway, and I know that soda ash is obtained through this industrial process that can be harmful to the environment. So I just thought, well, what if I just took out soda ash, just completely removed it from my recipe? And so I did, and to be honest with you, didn't really notice any difference. So I kind of needed to maybe adapt the recipe ever so slightly, putting a little tiny bit more like sodium silicate in. And the recipe that I've got in Eco-Friendly Pottery, that book, that actually has just sodium silicate in. It doesn't have any soda ash in. So just removed soda ash from my work, didn't notice the difference, never had to buy soda ash ever. And it's just been like a really positive thing. I don't have to use it basically. So that's my top tip number 6. Just maybe remove soda ash. Yeah. So, okay, so my top tip number 7, and this is like the best thing I've ever learned probably in terms of slip casting, is to use paper clay in your slip. Okay, so use paper in your slip. So paper clay is this incredible substance. I've spoken about it before. Sometimes I think I need to tone down my excitement of paper clay, because it is this incredible substance. This is like absolutely magical substance. Basically what happens is when you add paper fibers to clay, it turns it from just normal clay into this like superhero clay, which is really, really strong. It's like, it can be like, re-wetted, rejoined. It can be glazed at the greenware stage. You can glaze something, fire it straight up to stoneware temperatures, and it will be fine. It's just amazing. It stops cracking in your work. So that was the main reason that I started using paper in my casting slip. So what I do now is I actually use bamboo kitchen roll, sheets of kitchen roll, and I rip them up. I've got a certain ratio, which is again in Eco-Friendly Pottery. It's all in that recipe. And I use sheets of kitchen roll, and I rip them up, and then I just blend them into a kind of paper pulp, and then I add the paper pulp to the casting slip, and it's brilliant. It stops, it does make the slip a little bit thicker, but it still pours, and it stops the work from cracking. It's just brilliant. It makes it really, really strong. So yeah, I would highly, highly recommend that. If I just had to recommend one tip in this episode, it would be add paper to your casting slip, because yeah, it will save you so many headaches in terms of cracking. It's just really fantastic. It makes your work so much stronger. It's just brilliant. So yeah, okay, so that brings us on to tip number 8, which actually isn't a rubbish tip. This is actually really, really good. And this tip I read in a book, and it was basically saying that your plaster mould will absorb the water out of your clay, when you pour the slip in evenly and beautifully, if you just sponge the inside of the mould first with a damp sponge. And then what that does is it really just helps the plaster to start absorbing water, and it will mean that the water is absorbed evenly, across the whole pot. And what I can say to you is this tip is really, really true. So when I haven't done that, when I haven't sponged my moulds first and they're completely bone dry, they can quite often absorb the water out of the clay kind of unevenly, and they can make a kind of lumpy pot, or it doesn't make a very, very smooth, even-sided pot. So it's such a good top tip. Just literally take a damp sponge, just run it over the area that you're going to be casting into, and it just means that plaster will just it will just start absorbing the water out of the clay really evenly. You'll get a beautiful pot. Okay, so that's tip number 8. Okay. Tip number 9 is okay. This is a good tip. So basically, when I was learning how to do slip casting, first of all, I was watching loads of YouTube videos, and what they were saying is that if you you don't want to basically, okay, so you've got your thing casting, and you've got your slip in your pot, and then in your mold, sorry, and then when you pour out the slip, you don't want to put the thing, your mold, directly upside down to kind of pour out all the slip, because you basically leave it there for a couple of minutes just to kind of pour everything out. Because what can happen is it can actually make a kind of drip type mark on the kind of very inside of the pot, if you can imagine that. So basically the slip is all flowing out, and then you kind of a drip starts to form on the kind of the inside base of your pot that you're actually casting. And they were saying so what you want to do is actually turn it ever so slightly on its side, and then all the slip will kind of just gently run down one side of the wall, and it means you don't get any drip marks on the inside of your pot. But what I found when I was doing that was casting vases, and what I found was because I was casting with stoneware clay, which is quite thick when you're actually like you're pouring it in, you're pouring it out. It can actually be really thick and hard to get the clay out. What I was finding was that it was actually making one side of the pot like thicker than the other. So if I set the pot on the side, you know, as it was pouring out, it would mean that one side became quite thick, the other side was thinner, and that can cause warping. So in the kiln, you know, if one side is thicker than the other, it can actually pull a pot out of shape, and it can, yeah, it's very annoying, especially with a vase. It can make it into kind of like an oval vase basically, because one side is thicker than the other. So what I started doing is, instead of doing those two things, instead of like you know, either pouring the slip out and putting it upside down, or pouring the slip out and putting it sort of ever, you know, slightly to the side, like as a kind of, you know, an angle as the slip drained out, I actually started using a makeup brush to kind of, because especially, like I was saying to you, especially with stoneware clay often kind of almost like solidifies a little bit inside your mold, and it's really annoying. It's like quite difficult. It's not a very free flowing slip, and you know, other slips are much runnier. So like, you know, porcelain's very runny, you know, only needs a few minutes to kind of, you know, set in a mold, whereas stoneware can take up to kind of an hour in a mold to kind of, you know, properly absorb into the into the kind of yeah, for the water to be absorbed through it and stuff. You know, for a pot to actually be cast can literally take half an hour to an hour to cast a stoneware pot. So what I was doing was I was taking, this is what I do now, I take a makeup brush, a very big, like a blusher brush or a foundation brush. I think the one I've got is like a foundation brush. It's very big, like bushy brush, and what I do is I just gently put the brush on the inside of my mold, and, you know, kind of sort of, I guess, like agitate the clay to make it more runny again, and I just kind of just very gently like sweep the brush over, you know, the pot inside the mold, and then I pour out I pour out the clay then, as I've, you know, after I agitated it, and then I just very gently take the brush and I just brush the inside of the pot that I've made, and that just helps to remove any extra clay. It's so good, you know, especially with stoneware. Probably don't need to do this with a much runnier slip like a porcelain. Yeah, and then what I do is I just put the mold back down as it was casting, so flat. So, and that means you don't get any drips. It's all kind of even, but you've managed to brush out all of that excess clay. So that is my absolute very top tip. It's like, you don't need to put it on its side for ages to drain. You don't need to put it upside down for ages to drain. By just using a brush, a fluffy brush, you can just, you know, dipped in slip, you can just very gently just get that slip out of the shape that you're casting, and it works really, really well, and you get a nice even wall. You don't get any drips. You know, you can smooth any sort of like little, you know, little tiny little bits that are not quite right. You know, you can just smooth all of those with the brush, and it's just, it gives a really beautiful surface. And then by setting it down, you're all the drips are kind of, you know, going to the bottom basically, and you're getting a nice flat base, because gravity is like on your side. It's like pulling everything down. It's going to make a really nice flat base on the inside of your pot. So that's my absolute top tip in terms of, like, you know, when you're pouring out the clay after you've cast. Oh, okay. So this brings us on to tip number 10, final tip. And that is, don't try and cast too many ones at one time. So there's been days when I've just been like, right, that's it, I'm going to do like loads of casting and let's get it all done, you know. And what I found is that, like, the first one is great, and then the second one is like, okay. But by the third one, even if the day is like it's a super hot day and I've put the molds, you know, it's windy and sunny, and I've put the molds outside, you know, to dry, and they're getting, you know, dry, like, I'd say 3 castings in one mold per day is too many. And what happens is the plaster just gets saturated with water, and it just stops absorbing, you know, water from the pot. So the casting will take you know, longer. And that's quite hard as well, because it's very difficult to time it. So, you know, say like, for example, you normally cast and it's normally like 45 minutes, and you're like, okay, great, I know the time, I know the thickness of the pot it's going to create in 45 minutes. Then I can pour the slip out, and it's going to make a really good pot. You know, if you're on your third casting of the day, it's like it's going to take even longer, and you don't even know how long it's going to take, because you don't know how much water has been absorbed already by that plaster. So another thing I found is that the plaster starts to absorb the water unevenly. So where the first casting you do, it's all absorbed really evenly, and it makes this very even walled pot. The more castings I do, so like up to, so like I get up to 3, some sides are, very thin because the water hasn't been drawn out, and some sides are much thicker where, the water hasn't been drawn out. So yeah, it just never really works. And so now I know that probably 2 is the absolute maximum castings I can do in a plaster mold per day. And if I dry it overnight again, then then it's okay. But it can be quite tricky to time. Like even if you've done a couple of castings one day, and then you come and you want to do another casting the next day, even that can affect the time it takes for the slip to be drawn out of the pot. So the water to be drawn out of the slip. In terms of the casting time, basically. So it can, can increase, it can be quite random. It can be increase the casting time in a way that's quite unpredictable, and it can be quite tricky. Yeah, so the way I deal with that basically is like I was saying to you in the last tip, I have my makeup brush, and I kind of sometimes just agitate the clay inside, agitate the slip a little bit, inside the thing I'm casting, my mold I'm casting, and I can sort of see the thickness of the wall. So that's sometimes how I can just gauge. Again, it can be really tricky to know the right time to stop casting and pour the slip out, but that can help if you kind of just you can kind of just brush away a little bit of the slip, and then you can kind of see how thick the wall is, and you think, oh no, I think it needs a little bit more time. Yeah, it can be quite tricky. That's one of the trickiest things about slip casting, is how long to cast for. Yeah, but you get to know it, and that brushing technique really does help. Then you can see how thick the wall is. So yeah, right. Okay, so yeah, there are my absolute top 10 tips in terms of slip casting. So let's just we'll just run through those quickly again. So the first one is, if you're making your own mold, you need to give it a really long time to dry. Maybe even 3-4 weeks before you start casting into it. The next thing is, you can't really speed up that drying process. You can maybe put a fan next to it, but you really don't want to be drying your plaster mold with heat. That can really damage its integrity. The next top tip is to make your own casting slip. It's cheaper, it's probably got a lower carbon footprint from haulage. You can control what goes into it, you can make it exactly how you want to, what color you want, what consistency you want. You can make your own stoneware one you want. I've got a recipe in Eco-Friendly Pottery if you want a recipe for a stoneware casting slip. And so the next tip is, if you're making your own casting slip, use ball clay. It makes it very strong. It's a fantastic thing to put in casting slip. You can use feldspar in casting slips, but if you're firing to stoneware temperatures and your work is warping, it might be because you're using feldspar which melts at too low a temperature, like soda feldspar. So you might want a higher melting feldspar. You can completely remove soda ash from your casting slip. It has no disastrous effect that I found. And yeah, again, if you want a recipe, it's in that book, and it doesn't have soda ash in it. Tip number 7 is to use paper in your casting slip. It will make your work really strong. It will stop it from cracking. It will mean you can even glaze it at the greenware stage if you wanted to. Yeah, it's you don't need to add that much paper to make your clay very, very strong. Tip 8 is to just give your mold a little sponge first. That will mean that the water from the slip is absorbed really evenly into the mold. That's such a good thing to do. It might seem like a really small thing, but it will really help make a really nice even pot. Tip number 9 is, you don't need to necessarily tip out the clay and put the mold upside down or to the side. That can create kind of an uneven thicker side than the other one. You can actually just take a large bushy makeup brush or glazing brush or something, and just brush the clay, the rest of the slip out of your mold, and then you can just lay it flat and it will all kind of settle, and that's a really good way of doing it. You won't get any drips. And then tip number 10 is try just like not to cast too many in one day, because basically the molds just stop working properly. I found probably up to 2 is the maximum I can do. 3 and it all starts to go wrong. So they're my slip casting top tips, and I've absolutely loved talking to you about that, talking to you about all my top tips, and I hope they've been helpful for you, happy slip casting, happy potting in general, until the next episode, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you then. Happy potting. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.